serve under your chairmanship today. Can I also welcome the Prisons Minister into his new role? It's our first occasion opposite each other in Westminster Hall, and I hope it's the first of many. Thank you also to the Chair of the Justice Select Committee, the Right Honourable Member for Bromley and Chislehurst, for bringing this matter before the House today. I won't comment on the speech of the Honourable Member for Shipley, as much comment has already been made, but there have been very knowledgeable and expert contributions to today's debate, and I think a very large measure of agreement, which bodes well, I hope, for the future of prison policy, implementation and scrutiny.
Will she give way?
Yes, I'll give way.
I'm sorry that she's not prepared to engage in a debate and only wants to deal with people who agree with her, but can she set out for the public's benefit? Does she, therefore, can we take it that she agrees that people should be automatically released halfway through the sentence, irrespective of whether they still are a danger to the public and irrespective of how badly they've behaved in prison? Is that Labour's official policy that they agree that those people should be automatically released halfway through the prison sentence by law?
Jo Stevens.
People are released from prison when they no longer pose a risk to public safety and when the parole board considers that they're fit to do so. There have been some great speeches today. We've heard from the Chair of the Justice Select Committee that he is concerned that obviously the less safe that prisons are, the harder it is to achieve reform, and I think we can all agree on that. He also made the observation that he doesn't sense a sense of urgency with the new Secretary of State, and I sincerely hope that he and I are wrong about that, because I agree with him on that point. We heard a speech from the Right Honourable Member for Delyn, in which he described the staggering statistics that we have seen, illustrating the serious problems that we have in the prison service at the moment on homicides, violence, self-harm, riots. And I'm glad that he also mentioned the unique situation, as did the former Prisons Minister, of IPP prisoners, a legacy that needs to be dealt with and needs to be dealt with urgently. But I think perhaps the best line from the speech was the autumn leaves are falling, and we're still awaiting the autumn plan. My friend, the member for Hammersmith, talked about the lack of zeal and lack of knowledge that had become apparent from the new Secretary of State's appearance before the Justice Committee last week, which is of some concern, and also talked with great knowledge about his local prison, Wormwood Scrubs, and most worryingly, the staffing reductions that are on the horizon in an already very volatile prison. The member for Banbury, who's now left, talked about the strong leadership and statements on reform from the previous Secretary of State, the Prime Minister and the then ministerial team. And I echo her view that we need to see that from the new ministerial team, and I'm sure that we will do. And then I wanted just to make a couple of comments on the speech from the Right Honourable Member for South West Bedfordshire, who I enjoyed standing across the dispatch box with him. We had many exchanges, and I was pleased to hear his very knowledgeable and very measured comments on what isn't in the response to the report, but also what is. And I share his concern that accommodation outcomes and employment are missing from that response in terms of holding prison governors to account. The state of our prisons, and specifically the growing levels of violence in them, shame our nation. And we've heard today, despite party allegiances, that there is a large measure of agreement that the current state of affairs is simply not acceptable. And that is why I, along with my former front bench colleagues in the Shadow Justice team, at the time welcomed the Prime Minister's speech and the former Justice Secretary's commitment to place prison reform at the heart of this year's Queen's speech. And we heard a lot about good intentions. Prison staff, prisoners and their families, stakeholders and the public had their expectations raised that finally the need for prison reform was being seen as part of a wider social reform agenda to help people change their lives for the better. And it is very, very unfortunate that last week they appeared to have been let down by the new Justice Secretary in her evidence. But more of that later. In his last report as Chief Inspector of Prisons, Nick Hardwick stated that prisons were in their worst state for 10 years. And in his short tenure, the new Chief Inspector, Peter Clark, has realised, and I quote, that the situation has got even worse since then. So as the government presses ahead with cuts to the MOJ budget, our prisons become even more dangerous places to both live in and work in. And I make no bones about putting this on the record, it's been said before, but on a daily basis, prison staff are being attacked. Prisoner-on-prisoner assaults are increasing. Time out of cell for offenders is being cut. More offenders are being forced to share cells. Rehabilitation and training programmes for offenders are being cut. Education provision is being reduced. And services are being privatised or delivered through untested payment by results programmes. And prison officers have been living with the reality of working within a prison system that is creaking at the seams due to the starvation of funds it needs to function effectively and safely. Overcrowded prisons where people spend 23 hours a day locked up in their cells on wings with too few staff inevitably leads, as we've heard, to violence, suicide and self-harm. And we need to take bold action to reduce the size of the prison population in order to improve safety. I welcome the committee's recommendation that there be an action plan between the Ministry and NOMS to improve prison safety. But in order for prisons to be safe, secure and the places of rehabilitation that they are supposed to be, as has been said today, we need to employ more prison officers. I can't stress enough the simplicity or importance of that fact, and that has been repeated by many members in the debate today. There is very little that we can do with high-quality health and education services in our prisons if we don't have enough prison officers to escort prisoners to lessons, to hospital, or even in some cases, just to get their food. I want to make it clear I am not criticising those currently working for the prison service, and I'd like also to take the opportunity to praise hard-working prison staff across the country. They are vital to ensuring public safety. Their work is often overlooked. It is an extremely complex job, and the role that they play in rehabilitation is one that we must never underestimate or take for granted. They are a dedicated group of public servants, and they do vital work. And that's why it's so disappointing that the numbers of frontline staff have been slashed in recent years to meet the budget cuts imposed by the Treasury. So as we've heard, there are 7,000 fewer prison officers than there were in March 2010, and the loss of this many uniformed staff from the prison service continues to undermine the safety and security of our prisons and is putting staff and offenders at even greater risk. We now have this toxic combination of prisons full of inexperienced prison officers and experienced prisoners, and that is a recipe for violence. I share the Select Committee's concern over the government's failed recruitment drive. The growing prison population combined with that rise in staff assaults, there's no wonder that there is a struggle to recruit into the prison service and that retention is so poor. Those working in our prison service must have their health, safety and well-being properly protected. I also welcome the committee's call for quarterly progress reports, and I wait with interest to hear what plans the Minister has lined up for ensuring better and more successful recruitment and retention of prison staff. I've heard and I've seen at first hand from countless organisations and individuals about the dangers and the implications the lack of safety in our prison is having on prison staff and prisoners. And each time I raised this with the former prison minister, he was in agreement with me that the current safety levels are unacceptable and that this new bill that we were awaiting would include measures to tackle those issues. So on the 5th of September, in Justice Questions, I raised with the new Justice Secretary this issue, who in her answer told me, quote, "I fully acknowledge that we do have issues with violence and safety in our prisons. The levels are unacceptable. I am determined to deal with this issue and I will lay out my plans very shortly." And yet, not even 24 hours later, in her evidence session with the committee, she point-blank refused to guarantee to the committee that the government would in fact be proceeding with prison reform legislation to improve prison safety, much to the astonishment, I think, of the Honourable Member for Bromley and Chislehurst. At the same evidence session, it was also revealed that despite the report being published back in May of this year, there had been no response to the report, and we only received the response 2 days ago, and as my friend, the Honourable Member for Hammersmith, has indicated, a paltry 2 and a bit pages. That does not suggest to me that the government really are taking the issue of prison safety seriously. If I was a member of the Justice Select Committee, I think I'd be pretty insulted by it. In the same evidence session, the new Justice Secretary said she was looking into a number of urgent issues raised by committee members. In fact, she said it 39 times during her evidence. So my question for the Minister today is this plan for prison reform shelved? Is it delayed? When are we going to see it? There's no strategy for improving a decimated probation service that was previously an award-winning one, as far as I can see, and nor any idea about the benefits of our Human Rights Act. So what exactly has the Justice Secretary been looking into during the summer recess? It certainly doesn't appear to be a proper and timely response to the Justice Select Committee's report. There is no commitment to the central recommendation made by the committee to produce those quarterly progress reports on prison safety and staffing numbers. And to add insult to injury, I think the response about prison officer staff numbers saying that they have risen is unacceptable when they clearly are less than they were 12 months ago, as I pointed out to the Justice Secretary again in questions on the 5th of September. We now have 421 fewer full-time equivalent frontline prison officers working in our public prisons than we did a year ago. So, to finish, I have some questions for the Minister, in addition to those raised by my honourable friends, which I hope he'll be able to answer. Where is the programme of prison officer recruitment promised that was to deliver the real and necessary increases to officer numbers required to deliver a safe, decent and secure regime? Where is the national strategy highlighted by the Chief Inspector of Prisons to help make our prisons drug-free? Where is the commitment, the plan and the timetable for increases in prison capacity that will see an end to the institutionalised overcrowding of our prisons? I know that it's been said we're going to have 5 new prisons by 2020. I quite like the name of the builders involved because they're obviously very quick at their job, seeing as they haven't done much of it yet. I'm very interested to hear from the Minister more detail about where, when, how that is going to happen. And finally, time, after great cost to public purse, as has been mentioned today, reports into the dangers, problems and failures faced by the prison service, there have been many recommendations, often repeated recommendations for improvements, but they haven't been implemented. Will the Minister, in his role, in his new role, change that pattern? I hope that he will say yes to that. So, today, another 15 prison officers will have been assaulted at work. The same will happen tomorrow and the next day and the next day. And so we need to take urgent action in order to put a stop to that. I welcome the Justice Select Committee's report, and I urge the Justice Secretary and her ministers to urgently implement its recommendations. We can't afford further delay on this matter when lives are being lost, serious injuries are being sustained, and livelihoods ruined. It's an issue that's too big and too important to be kicked into the long grass.
Minister Gima.